and this is Debbie Andrews from the Alliance National PTAC, and we want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Financial Planning for Sustainable Nonprofits. Before I turn things over to our presenter, Kurt, I'd like to just cover a few logistics for today's call. First, all participants will be muted for the duration of the call. If you are listening through your phone, please be sure to mute your computer speakers so that you don't hear an echo. You can use the question and answer box in the GoToWebinar toolbar on the right of your screen to ask questions. And just so you know, those are confidential and only I can see them and we'll pass them on. So in case that's playing into you not knowing if you want to ask the question or not everyone on the call will be able to see the question. We will be saving questions until the end of the presentation, but feel free to type them in at any time. Second, this morning you should have received an email from me with the PDF that Kurt will be going over today. Also, we are recording this webinar and we'll send an email out to all of you once it is posted on the ParentCenterNetwork.org website. And finally, as you know, we value your feedback on our webinars, and we'll be emailing you a link later today or tomorrow for an evaluation of today's webinar. And we greatly appreciate if you can take a couple minutes to complete that. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Kurt Klotz. Kurt has presented at the Management Institute and also did a webinar for us in February. Parent Centers have found his information very helpful. Kurt is a CPA with 25 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, and he currently works as Finance Director for the Nonprofit Assistance Fund. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kurt.
Great. Well, thank you, Debbie, and hello, everyone. I wish you a good afternoon, and looking forward to a good webinar together again. As you know, I come from the Nonprofit Assistance Fund. We are a community development financial institution that is centered in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, but has a scope across Minnesota and some of the surrounding states. We provide, really our mission is the thriving of other nonprofits, especially in the financial management realm. And we work hard to accomplish that. We are a community development financial institution, which means we are a loan fund, but we also spend a good deal of our time doing training, technical assistance, consulting, knowledge sharing, much like we're doing today in a webinar format, in order to get the concepts and ideas and information out that we have gathered over the years of experience in trying to help nonprofits thrive. We know that nonprofits are a huge part of our communities, do great work all over the country and beyond, and our mission really is to help nonprofits stick around. It's really our idea that nonprofits have great ideas, are usually founded on a passion, and move that passion into action in the world, and we just hope that action sticks around a while. So that's what we hope to do, is help you all to keep your organizations going well now and into the future. We have an extensive resource library that I'll refer you to now, and certainly a lot of the things you see today will have been drawn from that resource library. You can see now on your screen down at the bottom our website, which is www.nonprofitsassistancefund.org. There is an S in nonprofits. That's always a stickler. That's how you'll find us best, put that S after nonprofits. But please go check out our resources there. You'll find many tools to use that are very practical. We even have coffee break webinars there, information about upcoming trainings and webinars, and then print resources that you're able to download and use as well. So today's workshop, we have 3 goals in mind. They're sort of lofty goals, and we have a lot of information. This is a very information-intensive, very dense webinar that we are going to cover very quickly, but I think it's important that you use your PDFs, and that's why I asked Debbie if she'd make sure that you had those ahead of time. You'll see as we go through that the slides that I present here, down in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a number, which is not actually the number of the slide I'm presenting. That's actually the page number that corresponds to the PDF that you've been given. So it'll be a help in guiding you as you go through this webinar. Ideally, you would have the PDF in front of you, either on another monitor screen or actually a printed copy in front of you that you could leaf through as we go. Because the slides certainly will present a lot of information. I will supplement that with a lot of information as well. but the PDF itself has many tools and sort of detail beyond what we'll even cover today that you can use once the webinar is completed. Also, as Debbie mentioned, I want to encourage you to chat in your questions along the way. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation, and really look forward to seeing what questions we spur as we go along. So the place we're going to start is assessing your current financial position. Really, in order to go forward, we always have to start somewhere. So we have to basically know what condition is our organization in. How do we read the financial statements that we get at our board meetings and in our program meetings? How do we use the information coming out of our finance departments to a good end? And in order to start a journey, you sort of best know where you're starting from. And we want to get beyond sort of the basics that you're used to. You're probably used to seeing at least an income statement, the usual actual revenue and expenses, sometimes compared to a budget. That's often the financial statement we see most often. But we want to get beyond that, and certainly we talk a lot about balance sheets here, which are statements of financial position. Those are a great tool that we think are underutilized, and we'll talk a lot about that today as well. But we want to be able to give you some ways of looking at those documents in maybe more depth and new ways you might not have thought of before. So we'll start with the balance sheet. Also, in GAAP terms, in nonprofit financial terms, the balance sheet is also known as the statement of financial position. Now, we went over a little bit of this in our last webinar. I'm not assuming that everyone who's on the webinar today was in our last session, but not to spend a lot of time here, but just to lay a groundwork, and then we'll get back to actually doing some very specific tools that we can use to analyze a balance sheet. But just to talk about the balance sheet in general, just to remember that a balance sheet is really it's sort of our treasure chest. It's what we're looking at that has information about all the resources we have available to go forward. What can we do? We have cash, we have reserves, we have buildings, we have all these things that are assets of ours, and how can we put them to good use in serving our mission? Now, of course, we also, on a balance sheet, need to keep track of our liabilities, things we already owe, basically a chance to look at what resources we've already committed in order to accomplish our mission so that we don't double dip or spend things we've already committed somewhere else. It's one of the advantages of accrual accounting, and I know from our experience with many of your organizations that we have probably, again today, a whole range of size of organizations represented on the call, and we'll try to speak to concerns at both the very small organization size of maybe 1 or 2 staff people and a board, all the way up to much larger organizations that may have as many as 100 staff and multi-million-dollar budgets. The tools that we're presenting are actually equally valid for both types of organizations. There just may be some logistical challenges that are different for each of those types. Now I'm going to show you quickly too the income statement, because the first tool we're going to show you is going to involve taking information from both the balance sheet and the income statement. Now again, like I said earlier, the income statement is really the statement we're most familiar with seeing. We see this often. Now the only difference in the nonprofit world that really makes us unique is the fact that we show both unrestricted and temporarily restricted columns in both the income statement and the balance sheet. And that's part of our accounting challenge, and also, happily, one of the great things about being organizations to whom foundations and individuals donate money is they're the ones who are responsible for the restrictions that we report. It's really donor-driven that we end up with money that is restricted to a particular purpose or a particular time frame. But as we look at this document, we just want to give you a new way to use income statements, and we'll go over several different ways of analyzing an income statement that will give you more information about your organization than just some of the things we're used to doing. And the first tool that I want to offer is basically assessing your current financial position by looking at your days cash on hand. We talk a lot about cash as king in our organization. Different than revenue, and we'll get to some of the subtleties there, but really if you want to know how your organization is doing, when you see a balance sheet, let's find out, actually, you see a number. Obviously, there's a dollar amount under cash, but what does that actually translate into as far as, you know, what cash you have on hand to do work? How long would you be around as an organization if no further cash was received? And this is a simple calculation. If you look at the bottom corner again, down in the right-hand corner, it references pages 6 and 7 of your PDF. And here's where you have both the balance sheet and the income statement that we're using next to each other here on those 2 pages. And also it's in those pages in the PDF where you'll see that there are some boxes drawn around certain line items. And those line items on pages 6 and 7 are where we're getting the information here to do this calculation. And the day's cash on hand is basically just taking your cash and your current investments, anything that's liquid, anything that you could dispose of very quickly, that you could spend without a lot of work, or you don't have to wait a time period to get an investment to mature or to sell a piece of property or something like that. These are all your liquid cash and current investments, things that you could liquidate by either selling or disposing of through your bank or a brokerage right away. And then to take that amount of cash that you have on hand and figure out how much do you need on a daily basis. How much cash is spent by your organization on a daily basis? Now that you're going to find on the income statement or statement of activities. And again, if you see down below, cash, and it shows you the calculation right there, equals checking, which is the $65,000 amount, savings, which is the $57,000 amount, investments, which is the $26,000 amount, and then your total. And then likewise, we go to the daily cash required. And there we're going to look at information from the statement of activities or the income statement. And there we have the total expenses, that's the $878,000, in kind, and depreciation. Now the unique thing there is that we're actually going to take out of this equation those expenses that are non-cash. So that's why the in-kind and the depreciation amounts are taken out. We have to be a little bit sophisticated about how we do this calculation, so we want to make sure that we're not including things that are actually accruals only. We want to actually be looking at how much cash comes in and goes out the door on a daily basis. So as you see, as the calculation goes on here, we have the $149,000 in cash and cash equivalents available. We found out our daily cash required is a little over $2,000. You do the math here, and we end up with 65 days of cash on hand. Now, what the question is then for your organization is 65 days of cash on hand enough? Does that get you far enough into the future that you have some comfort to make decisions, that you have some security to know your programs are in place? That number will vary from organization to organization, but certainly we want to make sure that you know what that number is for your organization at this time, and you can do some planning around it. It also gives your board a sense of where you stand, and future comparisons can be made. We'll look into the future at different times. You might want to come back and trend this information to see how you're doing compared to what you used to be doing. Has your days cash on hand grown or declined over a period of time, a number of years or months? The next tool I'd like to talk about is the current ratio. So if we're going to get a sense of our organization's current financial health, it's good to know, are we going to be able to pay the bills that we already have in hand? That's really what this current ratio is all about. Now, we must be doing accrual accounting in order to access this information. We need to have our current assets in hand, not just the ones that are cash in the bank, but also the things that have been promised to us. And then we also must know what our current liabilities are. So what do we owe people, not just what we've already spent this month, but what obligations have we accrued by signing contracts, by having ongoing bills that are due, that sort of thing. So the current ratio is the ratio between current assets and current liabilities. Now, we're referencing page 8 in your PDF here again. And this is a chance to look at the balance sheet. And you'll see here, again, we have boxes drawn around the line items that are in use. And it's a simple calculation. We're really just going to look at your current assets. And the accounting definition of current assets is those assets that are accessible within a 12-month period, which is usually the accounting period we're talking about is the current fiscal year. So within a 12-month period, what assets do you have that could be liquidated or expected to be liquidated that you could use for your charitable purposes, your mission purposes? And then likewise, what are your current liabilities? What are those things that are going to be due within that 12-month period, so that we're comparing current assets to current liabilities? And you can see in this organization's statements and in our comparison that we have here on page 8 that we come up with a current ratio of 1.30. And the one thing to say about that is that your hope is at least that that's a 1, because that would mean you do have enough current assets on hand to pay your current liabilities, and so you're basically solvent. If at any time that starts dipping below 1, you know that you might be headed for a problem at some point where you won't have the current assets on hand to actually pay your bills. You may run into a cash shortage at that point or be faced with some difficulties that way. So this gives you another tool to analyze your current financial position and make sure that you're in safe territory here. Now, the other thing about this is that this is another tool that you could trend over time, that you could be watching this and making sure that this ratio is staying above 1. You may even make plans proactively to try to raise that ratio over time by building reserves, by building more receivables, those sorts of things. Now, I want to talk about one more tool. I'm not going to spend quite as much time with this, just because, again, we have so much material to cover today. But our PDF packet actually does a good job of showing another ratio called the net asset reserve ratio. And this is a way, it's not the same idea as cash, which is basically what you really already have on hand that you could spend and what is your daily cash needs. This is more total net assets, unrestricted net assets. So beyond cash, it could include long-term investments, it could include buildings, those sorts of things, all your unrestricted net assets as a total, and then again coming up with an annual expense figure on a daily basis and figuring out how many days of expenses are available in your net asset reserves. It's just another measure of liquidity, another measure of your current financial position that you may want to consider, but we won't spend more time talking about that right now. Now, once we get a sense of where we are with our organizations by analyzing our balance sheets and our income statements, the next thing is to spend a little bit of time understanding our own business models. And we'll turn more to the statement of activities for insight on your business model. And again, if you look down at the bottom, just always keep referencing the page numbers down there in the bottom. Pages 11 and 12 now are what we're looking at. And the income statement, like we talked about, is really the place where your business model is starting to be exposed. And one of the things we'll always remind folks is that you have a business model. Now, whether you're aware of it or not, that's always to be determined. And there's no shame in saying that, well, you know, we've just sort of built our business model over time. We weren't really intentional about it. We just do our work this way, and this is where the revenue comes from, and here's what our expenses tend to be. And that's probably how most of us are at the beginning of the beginning stages of our organizational growth. Because we started this organization with a passion. We got it going with maybe a seed money or a grant from a foundation, and we're off and running. And before we know it, we sort of built into our daily practices the ways we raise money and the ways we spend them without much thought. But we want to give you a few tools to sort of analyze your business model, get more of a sense of what it is, and then allow you to do some proactive planning and changing around it. So first, a couple of ideas to give you, a couple of tools, again, to give you more insight into your business model. One we like to use a lot is the reliance ratio. Now, there's both the reliance ratio overall, and then we also broken that down into a single reliance ratio. And these are shown on page 13 of your PDF. Now, these calculations are basically going to look at what's the largest source or type of income that you have in your income statement. It tells you a lot about your organization, is that you can think of it as analyzing if we're dependent on one source or if we have a strength in one area. It's not necessarily a negative thing to have one revenue source be the predominant one for your organization. In fact, there was an article in the Nonprofit Quarterly back in May of 2012 that talked about that very idea, that I think that in the past there's been a trend or a sort of a fad to think that the way that nonprofits should be building themselves is always to have a very diverse revenue stream. We should have some foundations, some individuals, some earned income. Now that may be true, and that may offer a lot of stability to certain organizations, but this nonprofit quarterly article actually found out that most fast-growing nonprofits have mastered a particular, usually just a single income stream, whether that be foundation fundraising, earned income, major donor fundraising, government grants. They tend to be focused on one place, and really the reason for that is because capacity is at play. They really need to, have the capacity in place, both the personnel and the infrastructure, to be able to support that fundraising effort. So this reliance ratio will help you see in your own business model what is your predominant revenue source for your organization, and then it will give you a chance to make some decisions. Now in our example here, the largest type of income that they show is the corporate and foundation grants, which is line 2 on page 13. That's the $330,000. And then we divide that into the total income, which in this case is $905,000. That's line 16 of that same page 13 in the PDF. And what you come up with there is that 36.4% of the income is reliant on that one income type. That's the largest one for this organization. Now, good or bad is a judgment call. That's where you need to know more about what your hopes are for your organization, how risky is that particular funding source. Those sorts of things will go into decisions you might make later, and we'll show you some scenario planning and some other tools to sort of get at that in a bigger way. Now another ratio that's useful, and this one's especially useful as you're planning for the future with your organization and trying to figure out what do we need in order to build our base, to give us a solid footing on which maybe to grow, expand, start new programs, meet a need out there that we haven't met yet. And one thing at the Nonprofits Assistance Fund that we are big on is reserves. We talk a lot about reserves, the need for them, the fact that building a reserve is very important even in times when times are good. Certainly most of us in the last 4 or 5 years have gone through a difficult time in the nonprofit world where funding was scarcer, the need was up, and a lot of us have not been able to operate with the reserves we had hoped or the surpluses we had hoped. Well, this is a tool, the CUNA ratio, which is basically stands for unrestricted net assets. Change in unrestricted net assets over the unrestricted income is the calculation. And what we're looking at here is really to see what % of your unrestricted income are you retaining for reserves. So you're basically taking your change in unrestricted net assets would be the same as your net income or the amount that you had as a surplus for the year. And then just divide that into the total income for the year. And you see that calculation. We're on page 14 now of your PDF. And you can see the boxes around the 2 line items involved. And in our sample, our example here, we come up with a 3% CUNA ratio. So 3% of unrestricted income is retained for reserves in this year. Now, that's only useful as a comparison tool. We can compare it to either a target we set as an organization. We can compare it to our past years. But what I would really encourage you all to think about is actually setting this ratio, or setting a goal for it or a benchmark for it as part of your strategic planning financially. Because building a reserve, again, like I said, even in times of plenty, is very important for moving your organization into the future. So now that we have some basic tools for analyzing where we are, that's our statement of financial position, analyzing our business model, which is looking at the statement of activities and those 2 ratios we just talked about. Now it's to look a little bit, this sounds counterintuitive, but we're going to look into the past to help us plan for the future. And trend analysis is a great way to do that. We're going to try to get ourselves beyond just looking at budget versus actual, but actually gathering data that's going to help us with a broader picture of what's going on. So we like to start with income statement trends. Now these are, again, this is places where we're familiar. You can see we've basically laid out 4 years here. These are all things that if any organization is being audited, or certainly on 990s, you could pull together a version of this from just those basic documents. And we look at the trends. We can look at them dollar amount trends and see where we are raising more money in a particular line item or less, where our expenses are either growing or not on a dollar-by-dollar basis. But an even more interesting analysis tool here is if you see the column that's percentages here. Now, we talked earlier about a reliance ratio, and we did that on an individual line item just to see what our largest revenue source is. The way that these percentages are set up, you'll notice that they are what we call common size analysis. We're looking at each of those percentages on the revenue sources at the top of the page is calculated as a percentage of the total support and revenue. So now we know how each of those revenue sources compares in size to the entire amount of support and revenue. So we've basically done a reliance ratio in each of those line items. That gives us a different kind of a trend to look at. Now we can look at a trend and see that our grants, if we look at the second line item here, were 49% of our revenue in 2008 and have steadily trended downward to the point where they're 42% of our revenue today. Well, this is 2011, pardon the years, but in our most current financials, they're 42% of our revenue. Now, there again is information. Now, I'm not going to put a judgment call on that. We may have intended to put less reliance on grants over that period, and so we see that as a victory. Or we could be the other way and see that that was one of our main funding sources and are now finding out that it's dropping off as a percentage of our revenue, and that may leave us in trouble in the future. Again, the information itself is neutral. It's what we want, our expectations, our hopes, our strategies, that it will help us illuminate. Now, for an organization to be truly innovative, we would push you to doing balance sheet trends. Of course, I've already admitted we're very partial to balance sheets. But to do trending with balance sheets, again, this is a place where you can take, for example, you can take the current ratio that we talked about earlier, and now you can see it happening over time. Now, you would have to do those calculations here, and basically you would take the total current assets over the total current liabilities. So in 2011, this is again on page 16 of your PDF workbook. We would take the total current assets of $336,500, divide them by the total current liabilities, $197,203, and come up with a ratio. In this case, it's 1.7. Now, that's interesting. At least it's above the 1 we know is essential, but how does that compare to the other years? Well, we would go back and do some analysis and find out that the past years it was more like 1.2. So now we seem to be in a better state with our current assets than we have in past years. We're actually in a better position to pay all of our current liabilities. What that offers, what we see happening, is some flexibility. Now we may have more assets on hand that we could actually use to take a bold move at the program, make a decision to hire someone, things like that. So we always wanted you to get into trending to see where have you been, where are you going, and then of course we'll talk in a few slides here later on in the presentation about forecasting and getting into the future, which is where the real decision-making for nonprofits happens. Again, the thing about balance sheets, the thing I would always point you to is look at your total net assets. Down at the bottom, that net assets information is very important. What goals have you set for reserves? And one of the things I will stress, and I've said it already a couple times, but as you look into your next year's budget, as you plan the next 1 or 2 or 3 years, would your organization have the discipline to actually budget for a surplus if that meant cutting expenses right now? Even though things are going well, you have more funding in place maybe than you had 3 years ago, thanks to the economy turning, would your organization be willing to look at budgeting a surplus, even if it meant cutting some services, some expenses right now that seem essential, but it would be building a reserve that would give you flexibility in the future you don't have? Those are the kinds of questions that we hope you'll get at by using some of these tools. Now, just a way to sort of change up visually how we see information, we always encourage your organizations to look at doing their trend analysis in various ways. We had the obvious sort of traditional columns and numbers, columns and rows of numbers that we just looked at. But what about making visual presentations? If you look at just the top 2 pie charts, That's income, and basically this is, again, is the reliance ratios, right? This is letting us know how much each type of revenue was as a percentage of the whole. Visually, you can sort of get an idea of where things are changing. Some of your board members, some of your staff members, some of your management team may actually be better able to see trends visually than with the numeric presentation. So we're just offering a couple of ideas here about how to present things differently. You can see the reliance ratio down below. These are all actually various ways of presenting the same information. One of them, the income history down on the lower left, actually uses numeric again, but with a graph or a line to show you how those numbers change. The others are percentage comparisons. Now thinking more about balance sheet trends. I might have just gone backwards in the slide there. Excuse me one moment. There we go. Moving on from the trend analysis, now the idea is to get even more sophisticated about the way we're analyzing information and more purposeful about how we're using it. So we've talked about organizational status and position financially as a whole. To get more sophisticated, to get more useful to your organizations, now the idea is to look more at program-by-program information. So we'll go over first some concepts and tools again about that, and then work our way through sort of program-by-program looks all the way into doing scenario planning and how to use the information we've been talking about to do some future planning as well. So one of the things that's helpful when looking at program-by-program information is to start asking yourself strategic questions about funding. Now, in general, we think nonprofits spend a lot more time budgeting expenses than they ever do budgeting revenue. And we actually think it probably should be reversed. Revenue is really the thing that's going to drive most of our organizations because it does provide the resources we need to fulfill our mission to move forward. Well, in this case, we're hoping that we can help give you some tools that will make your understanding of your revenue sources more sophisticated. So if you look at this example, you're basically considering each revenue source you have. Now you could do this program by program, which will give you really the most interesting information and the most useful for planning. But just go through, literally go through each funding source for that program and ask yourself questions. Obviously, we have the reliance ratio here. That's the first, the second column after the name of the funding source. And that's showing you how much of your total revenue budget is coming from that source. And then you ask about risks, okay? Are there risks that are unique to this source? Is it basically, is it a government grant that you know is solid for the next year because that state budget has been set and you're sure of the allocation process? Is it a foundation grant that's a multi-year grant? You already have the signed letter. They've given you the first year's payment. You're expecting the second. Or is it an aspirational number? Is it something where you decided you have individual gifts last year of $60,000 and this year you're just projecting $75,000 because you're hoping to send out more letters and raise more money? You have to do some asking yourself and some exploration of your organizations to find out what's the risk to those sources. And then also the next question is, how are you going to treat that risk as you go forward budgeting? So now we're going to start giving you some ideas that as you budget, and we're encouraging you to budget program by program, to ask those questions about your revenue sources. How much and what impact does it have on your budget as far as its percentage, its reliance ratio? What are the risks unique to that source? And then how are you going to treat that risk in your budget? Now, what we're aiming for here eventually is program-based reports. Now, many of you have already moved your accounting systems to this kind of reporting, and a lot of times federal grant reporting and foundation reporting will push us this way because we have to track specific grants or at least specific programs in order to report to those funding sources. So hopefully you've gone this direction. If you haven't, we really encourage you to consider taking whatever time and resources you would need to get you that far, by basically building your accounting system to put out this kind of information. Now, one of the things I will point out is that part of being able to analyze your programs on a program-by-program basis, along with the sophisticated revenue analysis we just talked about, is actually making sure that you have the true cost of your programs calculated. And what we mean by that is if you look down at the very bottom page 19 of your workbook, your PDF workbook. If you look down, there's line 35 is distribution of indirect admin and fundraising costs. Now, for our example, I will say we admittedly just lumped admin and fundraising together. Now, I know for all of you federal grantees, we want to make sure I'm sure you are all well aware and would know that you need to separate out fundraising because fundraising costs can't be charged to many federal grants. But just to let you know, we've just lumped them for this example. But we've basically taken those fundraising and admin costs and then distributed them across the other programs so that the true program cost includes not only the direct expenses that we show in each of those columns, but also the proportionate share of those admin costs. So we know exactly what it really costs for that program to run the entire thing. That gives you better information for making decisions as you go forward. Now, another question to ask about expenses. Obviously, we get the true program costs lined out for each of our program areas. We know how much it actually costs to run that program. Another set of questions we want to ask is about how flexible are those expenses. Now, this will be more useful as we go forward, as we put this all together in scenario planning we're going to do next and forecasting into the future. We need to know the same way that we looked at each revenue source to see what the risks were inherent to that. We want to look at each of our expenses in each program and decide, now, which of these are flexible and which are not? Which ones of these change with the amount of services we provide? If we see a certain number of clients, does our personnel budget go up if we see more clients? Do we need to actually go out and rent more space if we are providing more sleeping facilities for homeless adults? Those kinds of things are variable expenses. It's what kind of flexibility is built into our programs, and how do our program decisions change how we think about our expenses and what our expenses are going to be. So it depends a lot on context. And here we give you just a little sort of pre-tool to our scenario planning, where we ask you to consider each expense and decide, is it low financial risk, low to medium, or medium to high financial risk based on these criteria. Now, the whole point of all this information, and as I said at the beginning, we realize this is very content-heavy, very dense material, but we're moving you with the tools that we've already seen and with some of these ideas now about how to make decision-making happen within your organizations and how to be strategic about it. We're trying to move you to some sort of pinnacle tools that we'll have at the end that will help you put all this together and start looking at your organizations and your futures in a more sophisticated way. But one of the things we want to do here is take all the tools that we've talked about, the liquidity analysis, the balance sheet analysis, the trending we've done, talking about program costs, and then we're going to try to match that all up with your program goals and your mission. Because it's one of the things that we know as advisors to hundreds and hundreds of nonprofits, that we have a mission. That's why we're really here. None of us came to the nonprofit sector to be financial gurus. None of us came here to lead organizations. Well, some of us may have skills there, and we were very happy to hire those skills. But really, the organizations themselves were not founded so that they could prove how well managed they are on the financial side. What we were founded on is we have some mission to accomplish. So let's make sure that all this analysis we're doing, all the sophisticated financial information we're pulling together, that we're going to put it to good use and really line it up with our missions and our goals. So one of the things we like to use is the mission money matrix. You may have heard it described many ways. This tool's been around for many, many years. We did not invent it. We just like to believe we put it to good use and help lots of nonprofits consider their missions and their programs this way. But this matrix basically gives you an idea to take. Now, assuming, of course, we've done the work that we just talked about earlier and got your program revenues and expenses divided out so that you can see what the true costs of each of your programs are. Once you get that information in a usable form, now you can start asking these sort of higher level questions. And these are places you'd probably rather have your board working than having them debate whether you've spent $200 too much on supplies this month. If you can give them the proper information, you can get them to this level and help you have a way more strategic outlook into the future. But as we look at this mission money matrix, what you're doing is you're taking each of your programs and having to do some decision making about where it fits on this matrix. So if you have a program that feeds homeless youth, you have a youth shelter, you have an educational program that helps youth after school, you might have very different programs, but all serving a general target population. Now you get to come back and say, where do they fit on this particular matrix? Some of them may have very high mission impact. They are really helping you accomplish your mission because you see what they do for people out in the world. But they may have a low score on the financial sustainability side. They're very expensive to run. It's hard to get funding for that particular project. That would put them up in the upper left-hand corner. Something else might be something that doesn't have a high mission impact. There may be an organization that runs a thrift store or has some other earned income stream that brings in lots of revenue, but on the mission scale really isn't making a huge impact. That might be down in the lower right-hand corner. Now, again, my particular value judgment on that is neutral. This is information for your organization to glean and figure out where do we fit each of our programs in this matrix, and what would that mean for our decision making going into the future. And that will become evident as we start talking about scenario planning. Now, some other tools just to use, I'll go over these quickly to give you a sense of ways to make strategic decisions. As you can look at different strategies you come up with, the strategies 1, 2, and 3 we put across the top could be strategies. They could be new programs. They could be your current programs, and just another way of getting at this mission money matrix idea. But basically, you want to come up with your own rating scale, and how would you take these strategies or programs or initiatives and rate them on these different categories: mission impact, financial impact, need and demand. If you can assign scores to these things, the reason we offer this tool is that sometimes it's easier to make very difficult programmatic and management decisions if you help remove yourself a step or two from the emotion. Because we don't want to cut anything. We don't want to give up any program that's been around for a while. We may have even personal loyalties to the clients, but all those things may cloud our business decision making. So here's a way to quantify some of the decisions and some of the questions that will come before a management or a board. And hopefully this will help you turn some of those more emotional decisions into strategic decision making. Here's one other version of that, which is a cost-benefit analysis. And this is more for specific ideas or initiatives. And this is where you might take, well, if you look on page 24 of the workbook, the PDF, the example they give is if you take the question of, we had a sample organization here. It says, this organization wants to increase its financial literacy workshop fees by 10%. So the question is, should we increase the fees by 10%? And you would basically take that idea and run it through this cost-benefit analysis. In the current year, what would the cost be to the organization in terms of mission, financial, organizational capacity? This is a great one to run. You can do a cost-benefit analysis on talking about raising more funds. You might decide, okay, we're going to have a huge push for an individual giving campaign. Well, often we think, oh, great, that just means we're going to send out more letters and bring in, 50% more money in that category. We tend to caution nonprofits to realize that there's probably some organizational capacity that needs to be considered in that regard as well. So you may want to make sure that you've considered that we might have to actually add another FTE or some equivalent in order to get those letters out the door, to actually follow up, to actually raise the money we intended to raise. So this helps you make sure that you've considered those things both for the current year and the future years as well. So another tool to be used. Now, one of the things about change in any organization, so I've been sort of throwing all these tools at you, all these new ways of thinking about our finances. We're preparing you to look at your organization's financial health strategically going into the future. That may be all well and good, but you may run into the very human obstacles in your organization to any kind of change and any kind of new way of looking at finances or any other topic in your organization. And this is where we just put out some ideas to help you think through those things. And one of them is just to realize that, human nature is in the mix. So if you're going to want people to change in your organization, it's people you're trying to change, all right? So that means who needs to change, whose ideas need to change, and how are you going to help them change those ideas? And these questions might help you get at that. And the first one, the types of languages and attitudes that are prevalent in your organization. That means, are there traditions that people uphold in your organization that are sacred, that really have a lot of meaning, and that you need to respect as you go through this? Or is there an entrepreneurial ethic around the organization, so you know that new ideas are welcomed, and if you just present it well, it could go forward? Or is there more inertia in your organization where people are resistant to change, and you're going to have to do more work helping people, supporting people, helping them through their worries about risk and change in order to get them to accept a new idea? So just some human nature sorts of things that we put in front of you. And then this whole idea about how dynamic is your budget. That's, again, questions to ask yourself as you start this process of implementing new financial management tools and ideas in your organization. Is who controls your budget? Is it rigidly controlled? Who decides it? Is the board very much involved? Helps you put your finger on who in your organization actually are the decision makers and who you should approach with your new ideas and be prepared to defend them. Helps to know a little bit about your management culture in these regards too, just as you grow, knowing how the professionalization, we use that term as organizations grow from very small to very large, tends to be a series of steps where things become more professional, different skills are required. Again, the roles and responsibility, human nature is that people do best, it seems, when they know exactly what's expected of them, and as long as those expectations are clear, they like to know there's a clear reward or response from the organization, or could be for some people that's compensation, for some people that's praise, for some people that's promotion. Just knowing what the triggers are in your organization that keep it running the way it is. What's the management culture that's already in place? And again, page 26 of the handout goes into some more ideas there that will give you more sort of depth into looking at these ways and examining your culture a little bit before you set out on the next stage of I was going to say fomenting change, but that sounds a little bit too revolutionary. But just helping to begin change in your organization, especially in the financial realm. So now let's talk a little bit about scenario planning. This is where we're going to be moving from reactive to proactive, where we're trying to take fear out of the equation. We're going to do some very specific analysis of revenue and expenses and start projecting into the future so that we can anticipate situations or basically evaluate plans or even come up with new plans. Oops, excuse me, went one too far there. So looking at scenario planning, here's just some things to think about. We're going to try to push you to think way more about income than expenses, like we talked about earlier. We're going to give you some tools to look at income that you can decide, is income all or nothing? Are we either going to get this grant or not? Or do we have sort of larger pools of money, either foundation grants or individual giving, where we aren't talking about just one gift but multiple gifts, and so then we have to sort of figure out how we're going to decide how much of that money we're likely to get. As you're thinking about scenarios for the future, think about, are there big events that are coming up? Are there economic changes that are underway? Obviously, none of us had anticipated the recession that we just went through, but do we have that kind of scenario planning in mind? Are we preparing for contingencies? And then we're back to this idea finally about how flexible are your expenses, because obviously we can't only concentrate on income because we are going to be expending our resources as well to get our mission accomplished. So here's a very specific tool that we suggest that you might think about using in your organization. The scenario planning that we suggest, I'll go through this first scenario. We'll go scenario 1, obviously. But the next several pages of the workbook actually go through scenarios 1, 2, and 3. And the idea here is that we start looking at what would happen if. That's basically the question you're asking yourselves. And instead of waiting until it happens, we get ahead of that ball a little bit by asking the questions, what would happen if? What if we had to reduce our funding by? And here it shows you just some scenarios this sample organization has gone through. So our annual funding, our budget, and it shows the budget in the budget column here, annual fund was $30,000. Well, what if we only got 80% of that? What if that number is too high. It's an aspirational idea. We really don't think we have the capacity to raise that amount of money. We haven't done anything different than we did last year, so we really can't expect to raise that amount. So what if it's really 80% of that, and we come up with that number of 24,000? Well, we talk about basically the comments and strategies section here. We're going to keep track of what our thinking was as we went through this. Because if you're like me, you better record your thinking, because coming back to it later will be very difficult to figure out, why did I make that decision? Why did I drop that by 20%? So this gives us just a tool that we're going to talk about our original budget, our plan, a contingency, and we're going to go through really line item by line item and talk about what change might happen. So in this particular budget, you see the potential budget reduction is $85,000. I'm just looking at the slide now on page 20 or 28. But if you look on page 28 of the PDF, you'll see that this really does go through line item by line item for the entire income section. And it shows you by the time it gets to the bottom, here you're seeing 85% of it. But by the time we get to the bottom, sorry, that was on page 28, you'd find that $79,000 had been reduced in income. So now, skipping ahead here to the expense scenario, now we have to go through our expense items and try to match, at least in this scenario, and the planning that's being done by this organization, they're trying to match that same $79,000 drop in revenue by finding out where they could change their expenses to meet that reduction. So this is basically getting you prepared for a worst-case scenario. So in this scenario 1, revenue was reduced by $79,000. So now let's go through line item by line item and talk about where could that money be made up. And so you see here again, senior team salaries. They show that the reduction by $9,000. And a little comment there says the senior team agreed to that reduction. The health program staff, reducing the staff there by $10,000. Says in the note says it's going to be reducing capacity in clients. We have to consider how each of those changes is going to impact our organization, not just on the numbers, but in the delivery as well. So, and the one thing, just as far as an example here, we're showing you a tool how you can do this. Now, the sort of larger issue at play is to think of these things, to be very thoughtful when reducing a budget, both on the revenue side and the income side. Because we always joke here about there's the chance you would end up with this situation. Say you have an organization that has a $500,000 budget and needed to reduce its budget, or actually let's just say last year it had a $500,000 budget and it showed a $50,000 loss. Well, the thinking would be, okay, in order to make up that $50,000 loss, next year we'll cut our expenses by 10%. So basically, let's cut our expenses across the board by 10%. That'll bring our budget down to $450,000. So now on first look, oh, we've just saved the $50,000 we lost. I will counter, and don't spend too long thinking about this, but I will counter that you may have just cut your budget to $450,000, and your loss this year will be $45,000, where you just cut your loss by the same percentage as you cut your expenses. So we have to actually be considerate and thoughtful about what we cut, where we cut it, and the impact it's going to have on our organization overall. So moving farther on, here's the results of this impact scenario. So it shows that the income was reduced by 10.9%, that's $79,000, expenses reduced, and this is going to leave us with a budget gap of 0. Now, I will tell you that you can certainly plan that way, that for any revenue loss, you're going to immediately cut that much expense. That gives you the balanced budget approach. You may choose instead to budget for a surplus. So even though your revenue is going down by $79,000, you would actually cut your expenses even more because you insist on having a surplus and planning for the future, even in a worst-case scenario. Or you could do the opposite. You may have reserves on hand, and you may decide that with a $79,000 reduction in revenue, you would actually only budget for $65,000 reduction in expenses and take a loss that year because you're willing to invest some of your reserve. It's the kind of decision-making that you get to when you are able to ask the right questions and do the right kind of planning. So now I want to give you, again, I won't spend a lot of time here on scenarios 2 and 3, but just to show you that as the workbook goes through these, the assumptions change. The amount of funding for certain line items is reduced even more, and you just follow the comments and strategies that are going on the far right, and the different decisions are being made. So the advantage of an income scenario and revenue scenarios where you have 1, 2, and 3 are that you can compare what might happen as you have different contingencies that you plan for. So income scenario 2, expense scenario 2, here's the general overview of that. Again, this is one where the budget was reduced by $159,000 in scenario 2, and the expense reductions were to match that. So again, there's no budget gap. It's a zero budget gap. Of course, you can decide to do it differently than that, and again, either budget for a surplus or a deficit for the year. But again, we're just going through the scenarios 1, 2, and finally 3, the same process, where you would take, again, all the revenue items first, then the expense items. And here's what we're finally aiming for, is that as you do scenario planning, you want to be able to compare the different scenarios and see what advantages or different disadvantages they might have for your organization. So now we're looking at slide 36, and this is the summary. Now the PDF version has a much more thorough explanation of this and example of this. But again, you're trying to get these scenarios next to each other, 1, 2, and 3, so you can, all for the purpose of making good decisions. Here's the planning summary that goes with that, and you can see as it stair steps down, what would happen if only the revenue was reduced by a certain amount, if that was matched by expense reductions, if the revenue was reduced by a larger amount, if we didn't reduce expenses, or if we reduced expenses again by the entire amount. And it just gives you the stair-step approach to see the impacts of all these items. And then down below, the narrative is really the key piece in all of this. Those narratives are going to give you, what decisions were, how they were made, what factors were considered, what strategies are in place, the impacts we think will have on the program, the impact we think it will have on our staff, all of those things, so that these decisions are not purely financial, but we also have integrated our mission and our program into our decision making. So the last place we want to take you with all this is actually looking into the future. Now, it's not crystal ball type of looking into the future, but one of the things that we have talked about all along is that your organizations may actually want to budget for a deficit at some time because your reserves are built up to a point where you're willing to invest in something. But then you want to see how is that going to affect our bottom line going into the future. Likewise, you might think about this. Actually, one of our nonprofit colleagues, one of our colleagues here at our office actually, wrote a blog just a few months ago, I think in January, called Because That's When the Nile Flooded. And the whole purpose of that blog was to talk about, we, for some reason, budget in only yearly cycles, when our organizations, we hope, will be around for longer than a year. So we're going to try to push you beyond budgeting for just a year and actually do your financial forecasting in something that makes more sense for the cycles of your organization and gets you more out ahead of the curve and gives you more of a useful tool going into the future. So if we could start thinking about forecasting almost like budgeting in a 5-year cycle or a 3-year cycle instead of just a 1-year cycle. Now here's some purposes for forecasting. Obviously, besides just extending your budget, really what this is a chance for your board, your staff to come together to put your mission ideas in place and then build out a scenario about where you're going in the long term. We hope your good idea and your good mission work isn't here for just 6 months or a year, whatever the rest of your budget runs out, but that it will be around again for the following year. Now, just to talk about a couple of these items, one, this whole idea of providing an action plan to achieve your strategic goals. We would like to hope that you start with your mission statement and any strategic plan you have in place already when you do your budgeting and your forecasting. But the other thing a way to get from point A to point B. And that's our hope, too, that you'll actually operationalize some of your good ideas and make it clear-cut for both your boards and staff about how to get from here to there. Another one of these ideas, if you look at the where it says identify capacity needs, we always want to challenge organizations not to be cheap and short-sighted here when it comes to capacity. If you're thinking about things for the future, make sure you're investing in the infrastructure that's needed to get you there, either the personnel or the actual facilities or IT infrastructure. Just as an example of this, here at our own organization, we actually, in our operations budget this year, have budgeted a deficit where we hired 2 new staff people for very particular reasons, one in our lending program, another one to be the director of our programs, to help us with our training and technical assistance and consulting work. We purposely have budgeted a deficit in our operations because we're investing in those positions, and we've done the forecasting to know that those positions will help generate future revenues that will bring us from that deficit back to a surplus even in the next year already, but we've certainly forecasted that out 5 years to make sure that we are planning as solid and that we know where our plans are taking us. Now here are the steps that we're going to suggest for your forecasting, and these basically we're using all the ideas that we have gathered today, the tools. Again, we need to know where we start on this journey to be accurate going forward, but really we're going to encourage you to take all the work you do on an annual basis for a budget and then just extend that farther, but to make sure you're being strategic about it and identifying what resources are needed to support any new costs that come out of it. Really very much encourage you to think about the difference between aspirations and reality. We all want things to go better. We all want more revenue. We all want to be able to expand our favorite programs, but how realistic is that for us? So again, the example, we can't just say, well, we're going to raise more individual contributions and that'll be our plug number to make our budget go up. Do we actually have the capacity in-house to do that, or do we need to train up a staff person to be better at that? Do we actually bring in another fundraising FTE? Do we have to invest in a better CRM in order to track all that data? Those are the sorts of questions we need to start asking ourselves. So now just finally, to give you a very practical look at a financial forecast, pages 40 and 41 start to show you what that looks like. And again, it really is, in a sense, just taking off from whatever your current budget is, your current actual expenses are, and projecting forward. But again, we'll always ask you to make sure you're interlocking your strategic plan and your mission goals with what you put into these forecasts. Oh, all right. Now, once you have your forecasts in place, starting with that first year, here's a little formula for getting from the first year, or your current budget even, or your current actuals, into your first year of forecasting. And that is to take what here is shown in the column as the core figures are really the current year's budget. And then those questions asked across the top. You know, are there any program activities, any mission activities that are going to require new approaches, that are going to be growth areas? You have to ask those questions, and then based on that, you can talk about adding revenue, which is what's going on in this example. Page 41 also includes the expense items if you look down farther on the PDF. But basically, again, to do all of the heavy thinking here and not to assume that you can just build a forecast by taking the numbers in one column and multiplying them all by an additional 3% and moving that forward. That's not a useful tool. What is a useful tool is a thoughtful examination of every line item. Now, that may seem burdensome, but you are probably already aware, at least your financial folks, as they get more sophisticated, are aware of which line items actually are drivers, which ones are variable, and which ones are likely to change. You can use that information and make the best projection possible here. And then as you go forward, making sure that, as you can see here circled down below, the question is, how will this be attained? So if you're planning in your forecast that the year following this one will actually see an increase of $10,000 in total income, how is that going to be attained? And again, asking yourself, do we have the capacity to do it? And here again in the financial forecasting tool. We just take that and go one step farther. So once you forecast your first year beyond your budget, use that as your base and then go 1 year farther. And again, asking all the time, what's going to fuel the growth, what's at play here. Go all the way back to those tools we gave you about the risks of each financial or each revenue line item, the flexibility of each expense item, and use all that information you're gathering and about your business model, about your future plans to make good decisions about each of these line items and where to go forward from here. So that was a very quick, very dense look at some financial tools that we hope will be very useful for you and your organizations as you go forward from here. Very much interested in how you can use these as decision makers in your organizations, how you can use them, the tools we talked about at the beginning to analyze where you are currently as an organization, how you are able to use these tools and put them together with your mission goals and strategic goals. We talked some about that mission money matrix, hoping that will be a useful tool for you as you consider which programs you have in place that might be better serving your organization than others, and then certainly about how to look into the future and how to actually start consciously using the tools and the information you already have in place, you already know, and using that to help inform longer-term forecasts. Maybe extend your budgeting process out from 1 year to 2 to 3 to 4 or 5. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hope that we have time for some questions. I think that we do. And just ask if folks would be, please chat those questions in now so that we can talk some more about these issues.
Thank you, Kurt. We actually do have a couple questions already. They're similar. They reference the income and impact scenario slides, and the one statement is, love the tool, where can I find it on your website, and is it in Excel? And the second question that's similar is, where can we get the templates to make these work for our organization?
Aha. There are two different ways to do that. One is actually, yes, they are on our website under our resources section. And the other thing is I can also email them directly to Debbie and Gretchen, and you could feel free to circulate them to all the participants. So.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, all the tools that we used today, and actually many more, are on our website in our resources section. It's probably one of the, well, we know already, it is the most highly accessed part of our website, and we encourage you all to go there. There's many topics, almost overwhelming number of resources there, but certainly the ones we saw today are there too.
All right, we'll just wait see if a couple more questions might come in.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, well, it doesn't look like anyone else is writing in any questions, so we thank everyone for being on the call today, and like Kurt said, you can go to the website, but also if he sends that document or the templates out, we can send those to all of you that were on the call today as well. So if there aren't any more questions, again, thank you, Kurt, for your time, and thank you to everyone else for joining the webinar today.
You're very welcome. I wish you all the best.
All right, great. Thank you.